Bernard Walsh adjusted his reading glasses as he stood before the town council meeting, his weathered hands gripping a worn leather folder. The fluorescent lights hummed above the half-empty chamber, casting harsh shadows across faces interested only in their phones. He had spent 3 weeks preparing this proposal to preserve the history of their Montana town before it vanished forever. "Mr. Walsh, we appreciate your enthusiasm," Councilwoman Davies interrupted, "but we have limited resources. We need to focus on younger families. Perhaps you could submit this in writing for future consideration." Bernard felt the familiar sting of dismissal. It was the 4th time in 6 months he had attempted to contribute. As a journalist since 1978, he had documented every major event, from the flood to the first internet cafe. His archives contained interviews, photographs, and first-hand accounts of historical moments that existed nowhere else. Walking home, Bernard passed the new coffee shop, once the first telephone exchange in the county. He paused where the old cinema stood, now a chain pharmacy. Nobody remembered the stories anymore. His daughter Jennifer called. "How did the meeting go, Dad?" Bernard sighed. "They dismissed it again. They see me as just another old man." Jennifer replied, "Maybe start smaller. Not everything needs official approval." Her words lingered. Bernard sat in his study, surrounded by decades of carefully preserved materials. This was not just nostalgia. It was the living memory of a community slowly disappearing. Next morning at the library, Meredith listened. "The council said no. Let's give your work a home here." 2 weeks later, the Community Memory Project opened, a modest corner for people to share memories. Then, a history teacher named Paul approached. "Mr. Walsh, I had no idea this existed. Will you speak to my students?" Bernard felt something shift. It wasn't grand recognition, but it was a beginning. "I would be honored," he replied. Grace Nakamura surveyed the empty lot on Foster Avenue with a mixture of determination and uncertainty. The abandoned community garden had become an eyesore, filled with waist-high weeds and scattered debris. At 68, she knew some neighbors viewed her interest in revitalizing the space as quaint at best, irrelevant at worst. But Grace saw something different. She saw possibility. Her engineering career had taught her to identify structural problems and design elegant solutions. Retirement had given her time, and the isolation of the pandemic years had revealed a deeper problem than crumbling infrastructure. The neighborhood had fractured along generational lines. Young professionals moved in, focused on their careers and screens. Families with children stayed busy with scheduled activities. Older residents like herself watched the community they had built slowly dissolve into a collection of strangers living side by side. Grace had purchased her home on Foster Avenue in 1985, when the street bustled with block parties and front porch conversations. She remembered helping neighbors with home repairs, borrowing cups of sugar, watching children grow up. Those connections had faded, replaced by privacy fences and garage door openers that allowed people to come and go without ever making eye contact. The idea came to her during a sleepless night. What if the abandoned garden could become more than just a place to grow vegetables? What if it could become a space where generations exchange skills, knowledge, and time? She had 40 years of engineering expertise. Other elders on the block possessed their own specialized knowledge. Meanwhile, younger residents had skills her generation never acquired, fluency with technology and social media that could amplify community efforts. She started small, knocking on doors with a simple proposal. "I can teach you how to fix things. You teach me something you know. We help each other." The first few attempts met with polite rejections. People were busy. They could just hire professionals. They could watch YouTube tutorials. Then she met Jamal Porter, a 29-year-old software developer who had just moved into the neighborhood. He answered the door looking exhausted, holding a screaming infant while his partner tried to calm their toddler in the background. "I'm sorry, this is not a good time," he said, barely making eye contact.
Grace noticed the broken porch railing behind him, a safety hazard with small children around. "That railing needs attention before someone gets hurt. I could fix it tomorrow morning if you have an hour free." Jamal looked skeptical. "You know how to fix railings?" "I spent 4 decades designing bridges," she smiled. "In exchange, maybe you could help me understand how to use social media to organize neighborhood projects." Fair trade. The next morning, Grace arrived with her toolbox. Jamal watched from the doorway as she assessed the damage, explained what needed replacement, and demonstrated proper installation techniques. She worked efficiently, narrating each step so he could learn for future repairs. "My grandfather used to fix things like this," Jamal said quietly. "He passed last year. I never learned from him. Always figured I would have more time. Grace understood that regret. The knowledge doesn't have to disappear. We can still share it across generations, just differently than before. Over coffee afterward, Jamal helped Grace set up social media accounts and showed her how to create a neighborhood group online. Within a week, the group had 30 members. Grace posted about the garden project, outlining her vision for a skills exchange hub where people could teach and learn from each other regardless of age. The response surprised everyone. A retired accountant offered tax preparation workshops. A young graphic designer volunteered to teach digital art classes. A former chef proposed cooking demonstrations. A teenager skilled in video editing wanted to learn carpentry. The list grew daily, revealing hidden talents scattered throughout the neighborhood, isolated by assumptions about who had value to offer. 3 months later, the Foster Avenue Skills Exchange held its official launch in the transformed garden space. 50 residents attended, spanning ages from 8 to 83. Grace stood near the newly built tool shed, watching a retired mechanic show a group of teenagers how to change a tire while a young teacher helped several elders navigate smartphone cameras to document the process. Jamal approached with his family, his children playing nearby. "You did this, Grace. You saw what was missing and built something to fix it." Grace shook her head. "We built it together. That was always the point. Nobody has all the answers, but between generations, we have everything we need." A local news crew arrived to cover the story, interviewing participants about the unusual program. The reporter, a woman in her 30s, seemed genuinely moved by what she witnessed. "In an age of isolation and division, you have created something truly special here. What made you think this would work?" Grace considered the question carefully. "I spent my career understanding how structures bear weight and distribute stress. Communities work the same way. When you isolate any part, the whole structure weakens. But when you create connections across different elements, everything becomes stronger. Age is just another form of diversity. We need all of it." As evening fell and residents began heading home, Grace noticed something remarkable. People were not just leaving. They were making plans, exchanging contact information, scheduling future sessions. The connections were taking root, spreading beyond the garden into genuine relationships that would sustain the community long after this single event ended.
Thomas Okonkwo sat in the back row of the Philadelphia Community Center auditorium, listening to yet another meeting about neighborhood revitalization. City planners presented PowerPoint slides filled with statistics, demographic data, and economic projections. They spoke about the area as if it were a blank canvas waiting for improvement. At 75, Thomas had heard these presentations before: urban renewal, community development, neighborhood transformation. The language changed, but the underlying assumption remained constant. Progress meant erasing the past and replacing it with something newer, shinier, more profitable. He raised his hand during the question period. "Have you consulted with long-term residents about what they value in this neighborhood? The buildings you plan to demolish include the church where 3 generations of families have gathered. The corner store you want to replace has employed local teenagers for 40 years. The lead planner, a man named Derek Chun who looked barely 30, responded with practiced patience. "Mr. Okonkwo, we understand change is difficult, but we must balance nostalgia with practical needs." Thomas felt his jaw tighten. Nostalgia. That was always the word they used to dismiss lived experience, as if decades of memory and relationship amounted to nothing more than sentimental attachment to the past. He left the meeting frustrated but not defeated. An idea had been forming in his mind for months, and this dismissive response crystallized his resolve. Thomas had spent 35 years teaching history at the local university before retiring. He understood the power of narrative, how stories shape understanding. He began the next morning by visiting Rosalind Hughes, who had lived on Maple Street since 1962. At 81, she remembered when the neighborhood was redlined. "Nobody wants to hear about that anymore," Rosalind said. "Young folks moving in now, they see old buildings and think we let things fall apart. They don't know what we fought to keep this community together." Thomas pulled out his recorder. "Tell me everything. I want to document the real history before it disappears." Over the following weeks, Thomas interviewed 47 residents. He recorded their stories in living rooms, front porches, in the barber shop, and the library. Each person added layers to a complex narrative. This was not a neighborhood that needed saving. It was a community that had survived and thrived despite systemic obstacles. He learned about Mrs. Patterson, who opened an informal daycare in her home during the 1970s so mothers could work without losing their jobs. About Victor Santos, who created a youth mentorship program that kept hundreds of teenagers engaged in education when schools were failing them. About the community gardens that emerged during economic downturns, teaching self-sufficiency and environmental stewardship decades before those concepts became trendy. Thomas was ready to tell their story.
The stories revealed patterns invisible in demographic data, informal networks of care, intergenerational support systems, cultural traditions maintained across decades, economic cooperation that sustained families through recessions. This neighborhood possessed social infrastructure far more valuable than any development plan could replicate. Thomas spent evenings transcribing interviews and organizing materials. His granddaughter Nina, a journalism student, volunteered to help edit the recordings and create a digital archive. She approached the project with enthusiasm that surprised him. "Grandpa, these stories are incredible," she said one evening, reviewing footage. "People need to hear this. Not just the city planners, everyone. This is American history that nobody teaches in school." Together, they created a multimedia presentation combining audio interviews, historical photographs, and contemporary footage of the neighborhood. Thomas reached out to Rebecca Walsh, a documentary filmmaker who had expressed interest in urban communities. She agreed to view their materials. Rebecca arrived skeptical but left transformed. "This is powerful work, Thomas. You have documented something rare. Most neighborhoods lose their oral history before anyone thinks to preserve it. What you have created here is a living archive that challenges dominant narratives about urban development." She helped them expand the project, conducting additional interviews and weaving the stories into a 30-minute documentary. They titled it Foundations, reflecting how the neighborhood's strength came from relationships built over generations, not buildings constructed by developers. The premiere screening filled the community center auditorium. Residents who had been interviewed brought their families. Young professionals who had recently moved to the area came out of curiosity. City officials attended, including Derek Chun, the planner who had dismissed Thomas's concerns months earlier.
As the documentary played, Thomas watched faces in the audience. He saw older residents nodding in recognition, younger people leaning forward with surprise, children asking their parents questions about the stories unfolding on screen. The film revealed a neighborhood that was not trapped in the past, but rooted in values worth preserving into the future. When the lights came up, silence held for several seconds before applause erupted. People stood, not just clapping but visibly moved. Derek Chin approached Thomas afterward, his expression humbled. "I made assumptions," the planner admitted. "I looked at data and saw decline. I should have looked at people and seen resilience. This changes how we need to approach development here." Thomas nodded. "Data tells you what happened. Stories tell you why it matters. My generation holds institutional memory that took decades to build. When you dismiss us as nostalgic, you lose access to knowledge that could inform better decisions." In the months that followed, the documentary sparked broader conversations about development, preservation, and community voice. The city revised its plans, incorporating resident input and protecting spaces that held cultural significance. More importantly, the project inspired other neighborhoods to document their own histories before they disappeared. Thomas continued conducting interviews, training younger residents in oral history methods. Nina graduated and returned to the neighborhood, launching a nonprofit dedicated to preserving community stories across Philadelphia. One afternoon, Thomas sat with a group of teenagers who were learning interview techniques. One student, a quiet girl named Keisha, asked him a question that went to the heart of everything. "Mr. Okonkwo, why does this matter so much to you? Why spend all this time recording old stories?" Thomas thought carefully before answering. "Because stories are how we know who we are. They connect us to something larger than our individual lives. When we lose the stories, we lose the wisdom that helped communities survive. Your generation will face challenges we cannot imagine. But if you understand how previous generations solved their problems, you start with knowledge instead of starting from nothing. That is the edge older people bring. Not that we have all the answers, but that we remember the questions and what happened when people tried different solutions." Keisha nodded slowly, understanding dawning on her face.
So you are giving us a foundation to build on. Exactly, Thomas smiled. Every generation stands on the shoulders of those who came before. My job is to make sure you know whose shoulders you are standing on and what they sacrificed to lift you up.